For all those who appreciate the work that we're doing here on Standing for Truth, please hit that subscribe button because we are just getting started. All right, guys, looks like we are live for this incredibly interesting and important topic today. We are blessed once again to have Professor David Mcqueen with us here today. We are going to be discussing the topic of zinc and copper mining in relation to the global flood. Before I hand it over to Professor Mcqueen and George for the usual jokes to get the party started, I want to point out that I've got a playlist that I've noticed a lot of people are benefiting from. A playlist with all of Professor David Mcqueen's presentations he's done with us. So make sure if you're new to this channel, please check that out because there is a lot of amazing information in those presentations from Professor Mcqueen. So without further ado, let me introduce Professor Mcqueen. Thank you for being with us again today. And George in the house. Good to see you, brother.
So glad to be here. Glad to be here today.
Good morning.
Here's my first joke.
Maybe I can start it off by telling the audience a little joke that I shared with you, David.
Please, and then I have a joke for you.
I just wanted to know if people in the audience wanted to know what kind of metal the Titanic was made out of.
Oh, I don't know. Tell me that.
It was zinc.
Oh, zinc spelled with an S.
Yes.
In zinc.
As in sink, yeah.
As in sink. Well, George, I want to teach you more geology as we teach the class today. So I hope you can see in this rock here, if I turn it correctly, that there's a fossil at the top. It's a fossil cephalopod at the top of this limestone here we're going to use to talk about the flood. But if this was an igneous rock, George, I wouldn't want you to be misunderstanding. If it was a granite, I wouldn't want you to take it for granted. If it was a granite. So there we go with at least the beginning of our jokes. As
I love it.
We start our topic today is both copper and zinc. Now we're going to focus on copper from the creation and then zinc from the time of the flood. But I want to make sure that we don't misunderstand that there's a lot more to it than that. Here are the, let's go back to high school chemistry here. Here's the copper and the zinc from the periodic table. I have come to believe over the years that both copper and zinc, as a matter of fact, gold, silver, iron, they were present in rocks created during Genesis 1, the first and the third day, and also during processes during the flood. So even though today we're going to focus on the remarkable copper deposits in what's called the Upper Peninsula of Michigan here in the U.S., and we're going to talk about the zinc deposits in Tennessee as an example of being on the example of the flood. In the map that you see over this shoulder here, you'll notice that at the top of the map, there's the letter C, and that stands for Chicago, if you know where that is in America. And then the N stands for Nashville, Tennessee. And the pink rocks that are to the right of Nashville, let me get my finger pointed correctly. The pink rocks that are here are rocks which contain the zinc deposits from the time of the flood. And then down at the bottom, George, can you see a J right about here? That's the letter J standing for Jackson, Mississippi. Is it visible?
Just.
What's that?
I said just. It's a bit fuzzy for me, but
Yeah,
yeah,
it's a bit.
I can make it out.
This, where I'm holding my hand now, is the Gulf of Mexico, and I live in this gray area. It's almost appropriate, George, that someone like me would live in a gray area. But here's the gray area of rocks that I live in Louisiana. And then north is at the top of the map. And if you'll notice in this blue area here, if I can get once again my hand going the correct way here. There we go. In this blue area here, you'll see there's a state that looks like a mitten, and that's the state of Michigan. Well, my geologic map of the United States here, of the Michigan Basin there, all those blues and so forth, cuts off at the part of America that is called the Great Lakes area. And I know that Standing for Truth knows about this part of America. Again, let's try to get the map up here close. There is Michigan, and then Lake Superior and the other lakes that form part of the northern border between the U.S. and Canada. The area that I want to talk about in regard to copper is this area here. Again, my map cut it off, but George, can you see the state of Michigan that's shaped a bit like a mitten of a child?
Yes.
The MI there, that's a postal code for it. And then above that is what's called the Upper Peninsula. And the area that I've circled in red is the area I want to talk about. This is called the Keweenaw Peninsula. And this is where native copper is found. And I want to structure our class today where we go for 30 minutes talking about copper and the geology of the creation week, focused on the first and the third day. Then we're going to take questions and answers up until my 1 hour stretching break. And then we're going to return and take up zinc in the time of the Great Flood, which is the area right above my shoulder here that you see in the pinks and the blues. And then we'll end with 30 minutes worth of questions. Does that seem reasonable to you, George?
That sounds good to me.
For an outline today. Now, George, I'm going to tie into your engineering knowledge by showing some things here. Here is a copper, brass, or bronze pot that I've picked up at a garage sale. But inside it is a mineral, and you'll see right above my head, let me move my head over to one side, a very great chart showing all the different minerals that are oxides and carbonates and so forth. But this is native copper. And if I put it close, I hope you can see the copper color and some of the oxidation of this copper. Many of you have seen, I think, the Statue of Liberty. It's copper coated, a gift from the French, but it oxidized so that if I go down into my bucket here and get out some things, we'll be able to see the difference between the chemistry of a bright, shiny new penny, such as this U.S. coin here. This is a penny. By the way, you know coins of the world, George? Which U.S. president is on this coin?
Oh, I can't make that out. Sorry.
It's Abraham Lincoln. It turns out that Abraham Lincoln and Charles Darwin were born on the same day in February. So that's two contrasting people. A little bit of trivia there of interest. This is an unoxidized penny made of copper. It's copper coated zinc. And then this is one that has been exposed to weather. And can you see the green color there? around old Lincoln's head.
Yes.
That green color is an example of oxidation. And so we have in the rock record native metals. Now, George, we've talked about this before. When people went to look for that famous metal, native metal in placer deposits, what were they looking for during the gold rush and other times?
Oh,
They gave it away.
In terms of gold, you mean?
They were looking for, I gave it away. I called it gold rush. So they were looking for gold nuggets. Are there areas in Australia where you can find native gold nuggets?
Oh, yes. Lots of people find them with metal detectors. I think some of the largest gold nuggets have been found in Australia, actually. And some of them you'll find in casinos.
Yes, I have heard that too. Now, remember that whenever we talk about flood geology, we're talking about really essentially biblical geology. And so it's important that we go back to the Bible as a historical document. Now, many people, when they argue with me about the time of the Great Flood and other details of the creation evolution debate that Standing for Truth has done so well, they will say, "Oh, McQueen, you Bible thumper, you, how can we know that the Bible is a trustworthy document?" Well, there are a number of ways that we can know that. And one way that we can know it is that it fits into geological history and geological truth. And so let's review the outline that we've talked about in the past. My flood geology model, which is really the same as what Dr. Henry Morris used in the 1960s and Andrew Snelling used around the year 2000, and the ICR geologist Tim Clary has used in the last couple of years in the 21st century. It's based around the creation, the time before the flood, which is called the antediluvian time, and the time of the flood, and then the time after the time of the flood. I don't know if antediluvian is a common word that you've run across, George, over the years. Is that a word you're familiar with?
I certainly am. I've heard it numerous times on this platform and Facebook, etc. When discussing evolution, of course, yeah.
Right. The for those of you that are familiar with the history of America, if a house was built before the Civil War, it's called antebellum. And so here in my state and in the adjacent state of Mississippi, which is right over my shoulder on this side, you have these antebellum homes built before the Civil War. And so we're now going to turn to the not antebellum, but antediluvian period after the creation. And we want to think about the geology that's talked about in Genesis chapter 1. A lot of people don't understand that the Genesis flood, I know many people call it Noah's flood. My former boss, Dr. Henry Morris, got so upset when people would use that vocabulary because he would say, George, he'd say, well, it wasn't Noah's fault, so we should call it the Genesis flood. A lot of people don't realize that in the first week of creation, we had our first flood. And maybe we should go back and talk about that. You know, on the first day of creation, you have light and darkness. And then the second day of creation, the waters above and the waters below. But the third day of creation, you have the formation of the one world continent and plants. Next week, if our plans work out, Mrs. McQueen is going to join me, and we're going to talk about teaching Genesis to 10-year-olds. And here's a way that we do it that even an engineer can understand. George, are you watching?
Yeah.
So here you got the one world continent coming up and the plants sprouting on the land. So that's the third day. Well, as the one world continent rose during the third day, there was a flood that created some sedimentary rocks in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, this area we talked about here, but also there were some basalts and other rocks formed also. Now, how in the world can we know this when we're talking about copper? So if you want to turn with me in the Bible to Genesis chapter 4, this is the antediluvian time, the descendants of Adam and Eve. And it comes to a certain part where we learn the genius of ancient man. Remember that one of the themes that runs through my teaching is that we don't have cavemen dragging redheads across the empty plains into caves. You'll get to see my redheaded wife hopefully next week, and you'll see that she would never have allowed that. And so we have the genius of ancient man. And so here in Genesis 4:20, we find this written. And Adah bore Jabal, and he was the father of those that dwell in tents and have livestock. The evolutionary anthropologists like to talk about these ages, don't they, George? The Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and so forth. Well, I dismiss that because the descendants of Adam, even before we get to the dispersion of Babel and Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the ancient people were intelligent. Here's the proof of it. They were making tents. They were dealing with livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all those that play the harp and the flute. Well, I would argue that even if they were playing a flute like you have in a marching band, they had the metal access to be able to build that. Now, they may have been making a flute out of something long and narrow. I know that in Australia, do I recall that the Aboriginals have a musical instrument that actually has two notes? Do I remember that?
Yeah,
it's a tubular thing.
Yes, they blow through it. It's just a hollow branch, if you like.
Yeah, but still, it's music, and that's something that's supposed to be associated with civilization. But this is the geologic part I want to get to, verse 22. And as for Zillah, she also bore Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every craftsman in bronze and iron. And the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. And then it goes on down to talk about other things. Now, let's focus on this passage, an instructor of every craftsman in bronze and iron. And here we get to a fascinating part of the Hebrew language, George, because when bronze and brass and copper are talked about in the Old Testament, we don't quite know what they mean. Now, let's refresh our memory here on what these metals mean. And for those of you that have access to my book, the mineral book, if you turn to page 24 and 25, you will see a discussion of copper there and the Statue of Liberty and so forth. And I discussed there the issues of brass and bronze. The alloys that these descendants of Adam and Eve we're working with. If it were brass in the way we understand it, brass is a combination actually of copper and zinc, an alloy. Bronze, you add one other metal to it. We could play a game here and see if Standing for Truth actually knows what that third metal is. It turns out it's copper and zinc, and then tin.
Three-letter word.
Yeah, tin. The word tin is used there, and so I will spare you, George, a trip back to college chemistry about the difference between cuprous minerals and cupric minerals. You remember that? It turns out there's a copper oxide called cuprite, and there's other minerals that are associated with copper oxides called tinerite and other places. But for now, those are some that are found both in Creation Week and the time of the flood. For now, let's focus on native copper, because therein lies just one of the most remarkable geologic stories that I know. To refresh your memory, those of you that have served in the military or are hunters and so forth, people will talk about, oh, save your brass. Well, here is the brass part that people save and they reload and so forth. Well, that brass is a combination of copper and zinc. A medallion like this, whoops, I dropped it there. I dropped it and knocked myself off. Can you still see me?
Yep.
Standing for Truth? Okay, somehow I've messed up my own computer here. There we go, I'm back. This is a brass or a bronze piece that's made of some combination of copper and zinc and tin. Now, these descendants of Adam and Eve in the antediluvian world, I believe, had access to what's called native copper, which is not an oxide. It oxidizes, and then the green color that you might be able to pick up here, the green color, let me bring in a lot from the side, see if I can make this a little bit better. The green color you see here is the mineral malachite. It's a combination of carbonate and so forth that's often associated with native copper. But now let's go to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and talk about this remarkable deposit that I visited in 1975 while a student at the University of Michigan. In this part of Michigan, George, there are basaltic rocks, and I'll illustrate them by these wooden blocks that I took from the grandchildren. And we're going to put native copper in between this. And sometime between the first day of creation and the third day of creation, these rocks were tilted. And you can imagine them being tilted into the lake that you see. And once again, here we go up to Michigan here, and these are the Great Lakes. It turns out in this part of Canada, that Upper Peninsula part, this part near Canada, those basalts are tilted or folded into the lake. George, is that clear enough that you can see what I'm talking about?
Oh, yeah, I can see what you're trying to demonstrate. Yep.
Okay, so you've got these huge sheets of copper there. Now, how do we know that this would be developed in the time of creation, not the flood? Well, the basalts are igneous rocks. If you were to find native copper, and once again, I'll show this. I think you all have had on before John Mackay of Australia, have you?
Yes. Well,
And
a couple of months ago.
Yeah, John Mackay and I collected this in Tennessee in 1999 together. He's a remarkable fossil finder. I would have just thrown this rock away, but that's a cephalopod there. And so this rock from Tennessee, because it's fossil bearing, is clearly from the time of the flood. So if we were to find this limestone with copper in it, we would say, oh, that's a flood year deposit in the geology of the Great Flood. But now we've expanded our vocabulary to what we might want to call biblical geology. Now, just how remarkable, and I want to check my time here, make sure I don't run over. The geology is remarkable, George. Now, let's go to electrical engineering for a moment. Do I recall that wires are made of copper?
Actually, wire was made when two lawyers fought over a penny.
Oh, they squeezed it and it became a copper wire. Very good. They fought it. It's malleable, so they were able to draw it out. Since our oldest son is an attorney, we'll save the good attorney and the bad lawyer jokes. Oh, no, it's my son collects bad lawyer jokes. For example, here's one. What do you call it when 20 Louisiana lawyers are found at the bottom of the Mississippi River, George?
Oh, no, I don't know.
You call it a good start. And so that's the evil lawyer joke. But at any rate, back to the geology here. Somehow I touched the wrong button again. So let me try to bring myself back here. Okay, there we go. So what do you find if you actually go to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan? You find in these lava flows native copper. But the reason I brought up electrical engineering is that in United States electrical engineering books, native copper's resistance is the standard. Its conductivity is the standard. And so you'll look up books, George, and it'll say Michigan copper, and it's got this conductance and this resistance. It formed the standard for the American electrical industry because it's so pure. Now, when you go to the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., you can see a boulder the size of our kitchen here that is native copper. So when I say these are rich deposits, they are extraordinarily rich. Now, how were they discovered? Let's explore that for a moment. And so the descendants of Adam and Eve had access to native copper, and they were able to find zinc and tin and so forth and make these metals that Tubal-Cain made, the brass, the bronze, the copper metals. Well, what about the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth as they migrated from, get my hand going here, from the west to the east in North America? These Native Americans, what we call American Indians, moved through the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And as they were moving across, they probably had children that cut their feet on this. See how thin it is and what a nice sharp edge it forms up here, George?
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Now, if you're walking around and your moccasin is a bit thin, you could cut your foot here. So why do I say that this kind of deposit is an aspect of God's grace? Well, these people, when they were migrating from Babel all over the earth, at least when they got to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, they had the copper sticking out of the ground. In the area of yellow here on the map is called the Mississippi Embayment, and there are all kinds of American Indian settlements there, including one I have studied in Louisiana called the Poverty Point Settlement. It turns out it's not a burial site, it's a site of commerce. And so you find copper arrowheads from Michigan having been traded down in the pre-Columbian days down the Mississippi River. Now, one of the remarkable facts that we were taught as we went to see this in Michigan is about one particular mine that they found native copper in. I don't want to bore you, George, with all the geologic vocabulary, but we obviously know that something like this that's native copper would be a copper ore, correct? An ore,
Yeah.
And then this is called peacock ore. And we're going to talk about this more next hour, but if I get a light on it here, I think you can see that it's got kind of a peacock color, and these are different copper minerals there. What you can't make money on is called gangue. It's what's left over basalt in the case of Michigan, or limestone in the case of Tennessee. In one of these mines, they sent the miners in one week and said, we want you to sweep up all of the gangue. In other words, they sent them in with shovels and brooms, and they swept up all of the small bits of copper that were simply on the floor. They brought those out, George, and smelted them, and that paid the mining cost for the entire year. The salaries of the miners, all the production costs. So the copper that was the actual ore was pure profit. It's an amazing story, isn't it?
Wow, and they found it on the surface.
Well, this, by the time the story I'm telling you, they had actually dug back into the layers. Let me use my two pieces of wood here as an example. They had actually, and that's a very important point you brought. When the French and the English explorers came to America in the 17 and 1800s, the American Indians that they talked to in Michigan, they showed them the copper deposits. And then as the years went on, the Western miners brought in, especially miners from England, the Cornwall area, and they began to go down into the ground, into underground portions of these basalt layers. And that's where the story about the sweeping up the gangue comes from.
Okay.
Okay, to summarize, and then we'll go on to questions. The Michigan copper deposits are a clear example, based both in scripture and also in mineralogy and geology, of an example of a pre-flood mineral deposit. Another day, we'll talk about the possible access that Adam and Eve had to gold, a compound called bdellium, and onyx, which is a kind of silica. But what questions, George, has this first presentation brought to your mind?
Well, I've got one, but there's a number of them that I catalogued in the private chat, so I could find them easier. But in terms of the post flood, there's a lot of evidence of copper deposits and many other minerals to that effect, anyway.
Yes.
That indicate a global flood. And by the way, David, I actually refer to it as a global flood because there are some Christians who believe in the Bible but don't believe in a global flood. So that's why I refer to it as a global flood.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
I noticed that Standing for Truth has put a question up here. What do we make of uniformitarian paleo-environmental interpretations? We'll talk about that more next hour, but I want to give an introduction when we're talking about Michigan here. Understand that the blocks of wood represent basalts, igneous rocks, and the copper is native copper. Now, around these are found sedimentary rocks with no fossils. That's the way, or that's the reason, rather, I can interpret them as being from Creation Week. Because if they're from Creation Week, you see it's before the fall, it's before death. As a matter of fact, if it's the first day and the third day of the Creation Week, no animals have been created yet. So there are no fossils in these rocks. So they are from a non-fossil bearing group of sedimentary rocks. But standing for truth's question, it still is a good one. Evolutionary geologists, traditional geologists, try to interpret a sandstone and shale environment as being near an ancient beach and near perhaps an ancient ocean area. And so even in Precambrian rocks, like these from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan drawn in red here, they still attempt the paleoenvironmental interpretation. Standing for truth, with your permission, I'll defer to next hour a more detailed discussion about the paleo environments of limestones.
Of course. Yep, no problem.
Okay, another question. What do we have here?
I've got a question here, and we've kind of touched on this in the past, but in light of everything you're saying with creation rocks, flood rocks, and then layers formed in the post-flood world, what are your thoughts, Professor McQueen, even briefly, on a post-flood boundary?
Okay, good. Let's get the blackboard out here and find out what I did with my paper. There it is. And let's make sure that everybody is on the same page about the boundaries that we're talking about. So we will draw it this way. What the traditional geologists call the Precambrian rocks the Precambrian rocks down at the bottom of the page, and then above those, the Cambrian rocks, that would be the beginning of the Great Flood. In the Grand Canyon, this is the difference between the folded rocks of the inner gorge and the Tapete sandstone of where you find trilobites. And then from that, you go all the way up through the poem that I've taught you before, Carry Out Some Dinner, Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Mississippian, Pennsylvanian, Permian. And then you get the rocks, which are designated because they have dinosaurs in them, to Johnny Clock, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous. And so I'm going to put only Cretaceous up here because you don't want to confuse it with the word Cambrian. Geologists use the word K for that boundary. And so that's the Cretaceous boundary. And then the rocks above that, so we've got Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. The rocks above that are called the Cenozoic rocks. And so if you're in Geology 101 and they talk about this boundary, they talk about the Cretaceous Cenozoic boundary. Here you've got most of the fossil bearing rocks, but still in the Cenozoic, you have other rocks that are illustrated by the yellow that you see on the map behind me. And I borrowed from my grandchildren some blocks to help us with this. If this block is the Precambrian rocks, and then I've got to reach down here on the floor because I dropped my blocks. Okay, here we go. So that was the Precambrian. The blues that you see on the map behind me here are predominantly those of the Carboniferous time in the geologic map. The blues and the pinks are Paleozoic and Mesozoic rocks. But you get to the yellows, you see the yellow there, George? That yellow finger that's sticking up like this. See the finger, the yellow finger, George?
Yes.
That's called the Mississippi Embayment, and that is pretty much unconsolidated siltstones and sandstones that are on top of the rocks that are bearing the fossils in them. Now, the boundary is the boundary between the yellow block and the blue block that we're talking about. This would be the flood year, and then this would be the post-flood boundary. This issue, in the way I think about things, revolve around probably the Cenozoic rocks that you see in the background there. Now, each of these yellow rocks that you see on the map behind me and also illustrated by this block, they have vocabulary called tertiary and quaternary. And so if you go back to the old vocabulary, George, of the 1700s, the primary rocks, the granites, were considered rocks from creation. The secondary rocks were considered rocks of the time of the Great Flood. And then the tertiary and quaternary rocks were those after the time of the flood. And they have words associated with them, like Eocene, Oligocene, and words like that, that are intended to be time markers. But standing for truth, you'd find this interesting. Those words, Eocene, Oligocene, those words were coined in the Paris Basin in Europe. They have more to do with geography than they do geology. But let me go back and make my comment. In my flood model, where you have unconsolidated silts and clays on top of hard rock, such as in the southern part of the United States, that's where I would draw the post-flood boundary.
Awesome. Well, that was a great answer. I just wanted to point out, George, that was a very informative answer on an important question that many people have. So I appreciate that. George, go ahead. I know that you saved a bunch of questions too. Go ahead, brother.
Oh, no, I was just going to add to what David mentioned. I'm sure you know something about Mount Isa in Australia, David. But
yes, for the class, explain that to us, please.
Yeah. Mount Isa is in the northern part of Australia in Queensland. And what they found was both fossils and organic matter and they've been found in abundance, by the way, in the shales. I think from memory, about 1% by weight of the Mount Isa sulfate ores contain organic matter or carbon content. Sorry, no, I've got that wrong. I think the carbon content is approximately 93% of the Mount Isa ore. So there's a lot of evidence for a global flood in the fact that we find fossils and organic matter within these layers.
Now, for the sake of the class, let me do a simple map of Australia. If the T stands for Tasmania, the island, I guess, up in the north, is there a city called Darwin?
Yes.
And is it on a peninsula kind of like that, or have I drawn it wrong?
Your drawing is way off, but I get what you're trying to say.
At any rate, is Mount Isa up near the D?
I thought it was up near Queensland. Queensland's to the right of where you've placed the D.
Okay, so it'd be to the east of it. Well, at any rate, you can see whether you're in Australia or in America that many of the flood year rocks, such as the zincs we're going to talk about, the zinc deposits in Tennessee, occur in rocks that are rich in organics. And so they're mixed in to the rocks of the time of the Great Flood. And I think it's important to bring in now what George and I have taught you in several contexts the water here of Noah's flood that you can see, this water is at a certain temperature and it's at a certain pressure. If I then pour salt into this water and heat it up, it gets a special economic geology name. It's called a hydrothermal brine. Now, George, from your engineering experience and also your experience on galvanized tanks that rust out, if you get a lot of iron, not iron, but rather if you get a lot of water that's salty and it sits around even on a galvanized piece of metal, you begin to get corrosion, don't you?
Oh, definitely. And I have it on personal experience. That's happened to one of my water tanks, actually.
Exactly. And so this chemistry of the things that we've talked about before, the acidity of this water here in Louisiana should be somewhere between 6, 7, or 8 pH. Remember that pH is acidic at 0, alkaline up around 12. So this water has a pH. As I pour salt in it, it's going to have a certain amount of salinity. And that salinity is going to result in an electric charge being set up. And that's the parameter that George and I have talked about before, the EH. Well, now we've got a fifth thing that we can add to this. And I'm so glad that George brought that up, because now we can add number 5 to our list, George. So we have pH and temperature from the past. We've got this electrical parameter called EH. We've got pressure. And now we've got a fifth thing, which is the amount of organic carbon in that water. So if we're talking about the flood year, and let's just stick with animals, the number of animals that were killed during the flood, George. Let's go to humans. Dr. Henry Morris speculated that there were 1 billion with a B people alive at the time of the Great Flood. Others have suggested 100 million, but that's a lot of decaying bodies to be floating around in the ocean, is it not?
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Okay, what other questions do we have from our class here, as I like to think about it?
George, I know you've got a whole list of them there in the side chat. Do you want to pick one, or did you want myself to pick one?
Yeah, I'll take one. One that you posted, actually. It's called, the question says, uniformitarians say granite takes millions of years to cool, which precludes a global flood. What is the best way to respond to this argument?
Okay. If you go back on the playlist, you'll see that last week we discussed Bob Gentry's work with radioactive halos. Those radioactive halos, in Gentry's theory, and this is a theory that goes back to 1980, occurs in granites which were formed during the creation week, either the first day or the third day. And so those granites were part of God's creation. And so in that sense, they do not follow the ordinary rules of cooling, but rather were spoken into existence. Now, I have been accused over the years by my geology buddies, and they'll say, "Oh, Mcqueen, yeah, that's real good, isn't it? Here you're speculating about rocks that are a miracle, and then on top of those rocks, you have the rocks of the Great Flood." No, that's not what I'm saying at all, or is it? My point is that we cannot know all the processes that God used during creation week. And so the granites in Gentry's theory were spoken into existence. Now let's go forward to the time of the flood. And let's find a granite there that Andrew Snelling has talked about, both in Australia and also in America. A granite that is actually intruding into fossil-bearing rocks. Let me get my fossil here. So this is the granite, and this is a fossil-bearing sedimentary rock. There are areas of what are called contact metamorphic zones where, how to say this, liquids that were activated during the flood, this is silica-rich liquids, granitic liquids, if you will, are injected into flood year rocks. Now, the rule of thumb that I want to teach you, George, from my geology training over the last 50 years is the best geologist is the one that's seen the most rocks. I don't want to discount what my colleague from AIG, Andrew Snelling, says, because I respect him greatly. I myself have not seen these rocks. I haven't traveled to Australia. The particular locality in California I haven't traveled to. But it's a theory. Remember, if we're saying that we're talking about the science of flood geology, if we're talking about creation science, then our critics must allow us to have theories and also singularities. We hear all the time, McQueen, don't be critical of evolutionary astronomy. That Big Bang was a singularity. Not all the laws of physics worked during that first few bits of time. And what about black holes? Well, if our critics are allowed singularities, then I'm suggesting that the heat problem of granites, such as are found in the base of the Grand Canyon, for example, date from Creation Week, no big deal. Now, what about the granitic rocks that are formed during the time of the flood? Once again, what have we got these in? George, let's remember Noah's Ocean. You got a tremendous amount of water flowing around the whole earth as a heat sink. So that would be my answer to that question.
David, one of the things I've brought up is we all know about ringwoodite, and they've estimated that there's at least 3 times as much water stored in the ringwoodite as we see on the surface of the earth. So there was a lot of water. So if you can, I don't know the figure, but if you can determine what the volume of water that we see on the surface of the earth, and you multiply that by 4, that's the total amount or volume of water that's actually exists in the earth when you consider the amount stored in the ringwoodite.
Yeah. Now, many of you that are in the Standing for Truth audience may not know that my old boss, Dr. Henry Morris, who passed away, was a hydrologist. He went through and actually wrote a textbook in hydrology that's apparently still used today, engineering hydrology. And those of us that worked around him, and I did from 1983 to 1987, during that 4-year period, I would ask him on occasion, how come in your book in 61, you didn't make a lot more about the hydrology of the flood, the idea of the fountains of the great deep bursting forth with water and lava? What about where all the water might have been in that pre-flood crust of that one world continent? And exactly why he never launched a big research project on that, I don't know, but I would challenge some of the audience, those of you that have a technical background, to do the calculation that George just suggested and multiply the volume of the ocean by 4.
I'm kind of curious, Professor McQueen. It's kind of a question that just came to mind. So,
yeah,
what do you believe roughly was the ratio of land to ocean or water in the pre-flood world? Because we know that the pre-flood world was a lot more green than today. But what's your opinion on that? How much do
Yeah.
you think land versus ocean?
Again, if we're biblical geologists, if we're creation geologists, flood geologists, we always have to go back to what the Bible says. And so we'll cover this more next hour. But if you go over to Genesis chapter 7, the great flood is covered in 6, 7, and 8. And you go to verse 17 of 7. It says this. Now the flood was on the earth 40 days. This is the first phase of the flood in my vocabulary. 40 days and 40 nights of tremendous rain, rapid erosion. Then there's 5 months of the water rising. That's flood phase 2. In my model, flood phase 3, the waters go down. And so listen to this. The waters increased and lifted up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. Well, the question is how high? Listen to this. The waters prevailed 15 cubits. I'll turn the page here. And the mountains were covered. Now, many people, and this is, George, I don't know in your experience if you know this idea of a pet peeve, something that gets underneath your skin. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I do.
A pet peeve? Maybe it's an Americanism of some kind.
I was going to say metaphorically I do, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, a pet peeve is something that gets under your skin, and it bears on this. It bears on this question here. Many people that I have talked to over the last 50 years, they say, "Oh, Mcqueen, there are marine fossils found on Mount Everest." And they have this view of Mount Everest, that here you've got this, and the height of Mount Everest is at 28,000 feet, 29,000 feet. I can't remember, but it's a lot higher than it's the highest mountain on earth, I guess. So they'll say, "Oh, Mcqueen, you've got fossils up there sticking out like these little warts on the side of Mount Everest." Well, it turns out that that's an incorrect geologic view of Mount Everest. It's not this view, which we'll just throw away. I'm throwing it on the floor. What the way it should be viewed is this. There are folded and faulted rock layers in the Himalayan mountains, and these rock layers date from the time of the flood. And inside those layers, at 20,000 feet and so forth, they are tilted and faulted. My F is not very clear there. I'm sorry. So here you've got fossil-bearing rocks, and over the years, as people have climbed Everest, they have found these fossils very high. But standing for truth, does that mean that the pre-flood the pre-flood mountains that I just read about are the size of Everest? No, I think that was upthrust during the flood. In my model, and this is based on some work by a guy named Jody Dillow back in the 70s, I guess, I have the highest mountain pre-flood being 10,000 feet. And so the Ark and Noah's Ocean rose to the level of 10,000 feet. So that's my idea about the height of the flood. Now, I may have not even answered your question. Say it again, standing for truth.
No, that was good. I was just kind of curious, and I think that was a really informative answer and helpful. The pre-flood world before the flood.
Yes.
How much land versus ocean?
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Water? What do you think roughly the ratio was?
I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay. That's okay.
No, it's okay. Now I see how to draw my picture. Geologically, when we talk about the breakup of the great continent, and we'll let this be north, and this is water, and I want to draw water all around this continent. Here is this C-shaped continent, that the evolutionary community, they use the word Gondwana land. They use the word the Tethys Sea for this body of water that's right here. I would imagine that continent, before it broke up, now keep in mind, these are sedimentary, igneous, and metamorphic rocks dating from the first and the third day of creation that have no fossils in them. So this is a non-fossil bearing continental mass. So if I wanted to put a percent on it, that's actually a challenging question. I've never really completely thought through it, but for today, we'll do this. We'll say that this continent, we can still find 80% of it, and that 20%, especially of the yellow areas on this map, these embayments, were added during the time of the flood. So I'd put it as 80-20.
Okay, so then in your opinion, because I've heard this objection or just question from the critic, but I think with the percentages you just gave, and I know roughly on the spot, it's an interesting question, but they have asked, would there then be enough ocean during the pre-flood time, or just water, lakes in general, in the pre-flood world to account for all the marine life that we see in the fossil record? I mean, we see some pretty gigantic beasts in terms of the megalodon or the dinosaurs.
Yeah.
So,
and
that being said, there wouldn't be a problem then in the pre-flood.
Oh no, because look at this. Here you've got a C-shaped continent, and all around it, this enormous continent was somewhere on a spherical Earth, and all the rest of it was water.
Right. Yeah.
Now we know that a lot of the marine life loves the beach, and so a tremendous amount of invertebrate fossils in the pre-flood world. Let me find a red marker here and just draw one piece of it. Let's say in the inside of the sea here is east of Eden, where the rivers flowed in this C-shaped continent. And so I'll put a red E here as an imaginary place of where Eden might have been. But you see the red there standing for truth?
Yes.
That red would have been filled with clams and snails. The geologic word for those fossils are plesiopods and gastropods. So all around the coastline, there would have been a tremendous number of marine organisms. But if you draw my red crayon all around this C-shaped continent, is it not true, George, that most people in Australia live within 200 miles of one of the oceans, the Indian Ocean or the Pacific Ocean, or most people do not live on Ayers Rock in the middle of Australia, do they?
Correct. And we have, I think, some of the best beaches in the world. Sandy beaches, by the way, not those rocky beaches you find in Europe.
How true. And when I visit you in the future, I expect to be taken there. But we'll save that for another day once COVID leaves us. But why would I bring that up? Why would that be important? A lot of creation scientists believe that the reason that we don't find more human fossils is that in the pre-flood world, just like now, people loved the beach. They were living all around the one world continent. And so when the floodwaters hit, these populations of, some people say there were 100 million people alive. You could have had cities where I've drawn the red there. I'm talking about in the over 1,000 years between creation and the flood. You could have a city of 1 million people there that would have been washed down into the ocean and would be now at a depth of 10 or 20,000 feet.
Mm-hmm.
When you've got petroleum exploration that is going down through, and let's see the size of this block. That's 1 inch, 2 inch. So this is a 2-inch square block. And a lot of the drill bits that are used in the petroleum industry are only this diameter. If they were to go down and encounter at 20,000 feet a femur or a hand or a piece of a skull, and then that gets brought up to the surface, a traditionally trained paleontologist would never even think about looking for, let's say, bloody tissue or a fossil remain from 20 or 30,000 feet, because that's supposed to be so deep that nobody's evolved yet. So if anybody ever has found this working for BP or Shell or another one of the majors, they wouldn't even know what they were looking at. They would just discarded it as some oddity.
Right. That's a good point. Right. Professor McQueen, we've got a lot more questions. We could probably answer questions for 10 hours. I know that we're now on the hour and 8-minute mark.
Good. May I take a break now and then we return
Absolutely.
back with zinc discussion?
Absolutely, Professor McQueen.
Thank you. You guys carry on. I think we've given you enough. Like I noticed one question here I see, hate, love, nothing says, what would prevent the flood from reoccurring since the earth might be holding more water than it's made for, like George's discussion? Well, the issue is the issue of judgment. The Great Flood was a judgment on mankind. What are we told in the New Testament that the next judgment will be? It will not be a judgment of water, but rather of fire. And so whatever mechanism that God released to allow the fountains of the great deep to break up won't happen again. We have a lot to worry about in the 21st century, but a worldwide flood is not one of them.
Amen. Amen.
Okay, go ahead and drop my video and I'll take my break and I'll be right back.
Awesome.
No worries. Hey, Standing, for the audience, maybe they're not aware, but February the 12th is Question Evolution Day.
Yes.
I was reading through a document. It was a video I was watching of the Altenberg 16. The actual document is called An Expose of the Evolution Theory. These are some of the excerpts I pulled out of that. It says, the consensus of the evolution pack still seems to be that if an idea doesn't fit in with Darwinism and neo-Darwinism, keep it out. A frank admission there. This is a quote from Stuart Newman, a professor of cell biology and anatomy in the New York Medical College. He says people, and I'm quoting, people are concerned that if they open up the door to non-Darwinian mechanisms, then they're going to allow creationists to slip through the door as well. These are some frank admissions, aren't they?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's just like a lot of your top atheist apologists, your most militant, such as Richard Dawkins, what they'll say is, don't even engage these creationists. You're giving them a platform. But what I find funny is if we were so easily debunked or easily refuted based on the evidence, you think that they would want to give us a platform just to show us and show the world how silly we are. No, it's because every time we engage them in debate, right, especially these professional debates, we expose their philosophy of evolutionism. And a lot of people in the audience are shocked at how much evidence there really is for our position of biblical creation and young earth creation. So,
yeah, well, the kids aren't taught. I know I wasn't taught some of this stuff when I was in primary school and high school, but yet again, they might not have had all that information at that particular time. But that's not an excuse to not tell people or kids what we do know today and how it contradicts everything they're being taught.
Right. Amen. I'll say one thing before Professor McQueen comes back on. Just a second. I think. There we go. I was fixing up the background here. So tomorrow, for the audience, anybody who just got here, we've got a big debate, the rematch between Jordan and Kent Hovind on Age of the Earth. And on the Friday, we've got Bill Morgan back here for a debate on evidence for God. And then, no, actually, that's Saturday. Friday, we've got a debate on whether or not the Noah's Ark's been found. That's going to be fun. And next week, we're just confirming a time, but we should be having Dr. Matthew McLean here to discuss baraminology and the so-called mammal-like reptiles, your synapsid and therapsid. So lots to look forward to. Hate Love Nothing says, who is Jordan? So Jordan he's got an atheist podcast called Reasons to Doubt, and he's been here numerous times. He's debated Kent on the flood. He's debated Bill Morgan. He's gone at it with George numerous times in the comment sections. Right, George? And he's debated myself. Ramad and I have debated him. He's a nuclear engineer, I believe, or he's at least got a degree in some kind of engineering. So his specialty would be like dating methods, age of the earth type stuff. So that's why it's going to be a lot of fun. And even though we disagree, I find that he's always willing to engage and have these dialogues, and I respect him for that. So
standing, I was reading an article last night of do you know who Carl Wieland is?
Absolutely.
Yep. Okay. Well, Carl Wieland was interviewing a very high profile geologist by the name of Jim Farquhar. He's an Australian geologist. He works for actually Rio Tinto in Western Australia. He's a young earth creationist. Now, get a load of this. He actually works for Rio Tinto, right? A very large mining company. And in the interview, this is what Jim Farquhar actually says regarding the age of rocks. I'm quoting him, the only reason that these presumed ages are used in the industry is to give a correlation of rocks, to be able to say these rocks belong to a certain group, which is more or less likely to contain a particular type of ore. But this classification can be done in other ways without any millions of years. For instance, calling a rock system Jurassic can be done based on the sorts of fossils generally buried in it, quite independent of the ages. For instance, where our firm is now mining, the sedimentary rocks labelled as Precambrian are highly likely to contain iron ore. So that's where we look for it. But you could just as easily classify these as pre-flood or early flood deposits. They could be classified by their position relative to other sedimentary layers and the types of fossils they do or don't contain. Such a classification would be just as useful to the mining industry without any millions of years. Now, there you go. There's a young earth creationist geologist who works for a large mining company, Rio Tinto, who says it makes no difference whether you classify the rocks into millions and billions of years. It's just a classification system. It's got nothing to do with the age of the rocks. And they keep going on about this. They need deep earth or deep time geology to find these minerals. What a load of baloney.
Oh, I know. It brings one of our favorite critics to mind, where we've addressed it so many times, refuted it so many times in so many different ways. Okay, but yet it's still repeated, because when it's their top 3 to 5 best arguments that they love so much, when those arguments are dismantled, Well, it's either tap out and admit you were wrong, or double down and continue using them. And one last thing I'll say, and then we'll bring Professor McQueen back in here. But George, you're amazing on this topic, and I keep seeing it still. Okay, we've had Dr. Jason Lyle on, Professor McQueen every single week, and we've refuted their best arguments against the lines of evidence that puts a limit on the age of the Earth. For example, the C14 in diamonds, right? And I've seen some of our favorite critics still repeat the argument that claims, and we address this, George. Maybe you can say a couple things on it, because I like the points you brought up, and then we'll jump into the second half. But they keep claiming that there is additional nuclear material down where the diamonds are, okay? Because we know that the C14 found in diamonds puts a limit to the age of the Earth. And they keep saying, oh, don't the young Earth creationists know that this has been debunked? So one specific critic keeps saying that there's other nuclear material down where the diamonds are, okay? Or at least implying that this can recharge the C14. Okay, but we discussed, George, why that just doesn't work and why we've demolished this over and over again. Okay, we've had Dr. Lyle on who demolished that argument. But for one, okay, I like to point out the rate team themselves, the rate group, okay, they looked into that. They looked into all these claims and possible arguments and rescue devices, okay? And what did they estimate, George? Wasn't it like 13,000 times more nuclear material would be needed in the nearby rocks to actually adequately recharge the C14? So how is that rescue device possible? But yet they still keep repeating these rescue devices. What are your thoughts on that, George, real quick, before I know you really like the diamond topic.
Oh yeah, you're correct. It's a bit like the moon impact theory. That's been debunked by so many lines of evidence that they have to appeal to it because they've got nothing better to replace it with. So it's the same with the contamination of the diamonds. I mean, you and I have discussed it, and I've written an appendix for one of your books on this subject. Yeah. I mean, Dr. Baumgartner and Dr. Safadi that I've had conversations with through emails have calculated that yes, you can get additional carbon-14 forming in the diamond because of the trace elements. You get nitrogen-14 as a trace element in the diamond, which means that nitrogen-14 was part of the diamond when it was formed. But the problem is this: the carbon-14 is decaying 800,000 times faster than the uranium can make it. And even if you did have 13,000 times more nuclear decay nearby, what you end up with is a diamond you'd never wear. And secondly, the calculations show that it would only add 0.0001 percentage modern carbon to the result. That is negligent because the AMS method, which is the most accurate method there is today, can only measure to 3 decimal places. So the 0.0001 is the 4th decimal place. It makes absolutely no difference to the result. Really, I shouldn't swear, but I won't. No, it's a bit like, your glasses are fogged up.
Right.
That's an in-joke, by the way.
Fogged, Fogged. So, and it makes no difference, apparently, I guess, to the evolutionists, too, these critics, that all their best rescue devices have been answered. They've been looked at in terms of these arguments to rescue themselves out of the evidence in diamonds that limits the age of the Earth. It makes no difference to them, apparently, because they'll still keep repeating the talking points. But anyways, we've got Professor McQueen back with us. I hope you had a good break there, Professor McQueen. Incredible first half. So God bless you.
The diamond argument I'd like to return to in April or May and spend a whole session on that. I noticed your all's discussion as I was getting my tea about the origin of species. Here's my favorite copy of that. I love showing the evolution from what George and I once were to what we are now. So that's a great picture there. The reason that February is important as a let's criticize Darwin Day is that Abraham Lincoln and Charles Darwin were born the same month, the same day, the same year. And so here you've got two lives, Lincoln freeing the slaves, Darwin writing a book whose preface says, oh, look how these guys, look how, I hate the way they did this. Origin of Species, complete and fully illustrated, but they don't give you the complete, oh, that makes me so angry. They don't give you the complete title of it, which includes the word favored races. But before we get into sedimentary rocks, if you don't have a copy of this, you need to go back and buy one because chapter 10 of this 1859 publication is on the geological succession of organic beings. And I love how optimistic Darwin was in 1859. Listen to this. Let us now see whether the several facts and rules relating to the geological succession of organic beings is a better accord with the common view of the immutability of species, or of that their slow and gradual modification through descent and natural selection. And he goes on to talk about all kinds of things about Lyell and extinction and so forth. And he's got plates in this edition of dinosaurs. Well, what's my point? Darwin was optimistic. He said the geological succession is a real problem for my idea, but if we give geologists just another 100 years, listen to his optimism. This is the last paragraph of chapter 10. If then the geological record be as imperfect as I believe it to be, and it may at least be asserted that the record cannot be proved to be much more perfect, the main objections to the theory of natural selections diminish or disappear. However, the chief laws of paleontology plainly proclaim, it seems to me, that species have been produced by ordinary generations, old forms being supplanted by new forms. And as he goes through the book, the man's an optimist. He says, oh, in 100 years, we will find those transitional organisms, which we have not, George, correct?
Correct. They want it to be true, David, so that's why they have to add this very special ingredient called imagination to those fossils they find, and they call them transitionals.
Okay. The next hour we want to spend with zinc deposits, and I want to recommend some references to you. This big old thick book here is one volume of what's called the ore deposits in the United States. It's called the Grattan Sales volume, put out by the American Institute of Mining Engineers. On the front cover of this is the copper from the UP of Michigan. That's what the front cover is. And then inside the pages of this very complicated book is talked about Mississippi Valley lead zinc deposits. And so that's what we're going to turn to now. And yes.
David, before you go further, I have to leave in about half an hour.
Okay.
But I'll leave it in the capable hands of SFT, because I've made arrangements to have my car serviced, and I've had to ring them up once now to have it delayed. So I hope you don't mind. In about half an hour, I have to leave.
That's okay. I have a car in disrepair, so I understand exactly why you have to leave.
Complete. And I'll say in half an hour will be the 2-hour mark anyways. So we'll probably start winding it down that. I can't believe it's already been an hour and a half. Time's flying by as always,
Yeah.
Professor McQueen.
I took a longer break than I should. So
no, that's okay. That's okay.
Let's go right into it here. We've talked about the yellow rocks, and now I want to turn our attention, if I can move my map here a bit closer, to the pink rocks that you see right going from my shoulder here to my head. Those are the Southern Appalachian Mountains. And those rocks are flood year rocks. They are exactly, I might add, the rocks that that Australian friend of mine, John Mackay, and I collected back in 1999. This is a fossil cephalopod here. These very rocks are found in the pink zone that you see behind me. The flat-lying limestones that are found in that part were deposited, no doubt, in my theory, sometime in the first 6 months of the flood, what I call phase 1 or phase 2. And so these flat-lying limestones, as the one supercontinent broke apart, the fountains of the I can't even talk. The fountains of the great deep are breaking up. The windows of heaven are crashing down water and so forth. As those tectonic forces move, in the idea of catastrophic plate tectonics we talked about last week, the rocks are folded up like this into anticlines and synclines. And so what we have in the state that I grew up in, called Tennessee, we have what's called a Mississippi Valley lead zinc deposit. Now, if you'll notice the yellow area that I've talked about several times before, that's called the Mississippi Embayment, and it goes up through the Mississippi River. And as you go up the Mississippi River, maybe a 6-hour drive north of me, are some huge lead mines in Missouri and other states in America. But where I grew up in Tennessee, it's predominantly zinc sulfide, which is called sphalerite. So what you have is a deposit that I had intended to be my PhD work at Michigan, but that did not work out as I had hoped. It's called a collapsed breccia, and my printing is not good. It's BRECCIA, a collapsed breccia deposit in these limestones. Now, for those of you that are students and like to look into things, you can look up Mississippi Valley lead zinc deposits, and the internet will overflow with examples of theories of how these are formed. My theory about how they are formed deal with mines that I've been into myself in East Tennessee, things I've seen with my own eyes. George, you ever spent much time in a cave? Have you ever been either in a commercial or a natural cave?
I've been in both, actually. I actually went into a tunnel that they were building in Melbourne for the underground rail loop, but also was in the caves in Sheffield, Tasmania. And believe me, we went in there, and the tour guide actually turned the lights off.
Yeah, I've had that experience.
That's one of the most amazing experiences you ever see. You can put your hand in front of your eyes and you cannot see it. Well, yeah. Imagine underneath, so the arc is floating up here. Underneath all that column of water, you have water moving through and producing a cave. So the arch that I've drawn there is a cave that was produced during the time of the flood. And those blocks are broken bits of rocks that are called breccia. And they've collapsed from the top of that cave. And so when you have this kind of environment,
let me go to my red pen here. We're going to draw in what we talked about previously, a hydrothermal brine, hot, salty water, moving through this, and I'm trying to think of the thickness of these limestones. Let's use 100 meters to start with. So you've got hot, salty water moving where I've put the red mark there. And as those hydrothermal brines move through the rock column, they pick up copper, lead, zinc, gold, silver. But in this case, they must have moved through an area very rich in the element zinc. And so when they hit the cave, it is normal. Well, that's not the right word. Is it not predictable, George, that when they came from the left or the right, the north or the south, the top or the bottom, that they might have encountered a different set of parameters that we outlined before? This whole set of things we've worked on flood year geochemistry, a different temperature and pH. That's reasonable, isn't it?
Well, yeah. I was reading just last night something that Dr. Snelling actually said in one of his articles. He says this is about Mount Isa. Most geologists today agree that the minerals at Mount Isa were originally deposited at the same time. In addition, he says, it is now commonly recognized that they were deposited by hot, underwater, metal-rich volcanic springs like those found today in the Red Sea, the Gulf of California, and the East Pacific. I thought that was amazing, what he said.
And see, it's like I've told you before, in my conversations with Dr. Snelling, I've told him, I'm more handsome than you are, but you are smarter than me. And that is exactly what I'm describing here, that these zinc-rich fluids precipitate out zinc sulfide. And so if you go into these mines, as I have, you see these blocks of limestone, and covering them are the mineral sphalerite. To use the vocabulary of last hour, the zinc, which would be my hands, is the ore, and the limestone would be called gangue, Gangue. It's what's not used. So because we're running out of time, I'll quickly say that this collapsed breccia model, which has been suggested by traditional evolutionary geologists for 100 years, this collapsed breccia model can more easily be explained in a flood environment where you've got the kind of hot, salty, metal-rich brines that Dr. Snelling covered in that quote. Okay, I think we'll finish off the time now with questions. Since George has to leave, why don't you ask the first question, George?
Well, I was just going to add to that last part that I mentioned, David, the Snelling article. Excuse me. He goes on to say statistical analysis of the metal ores and the sediments they are in shows that all the silver, lead, zinc, iron ore bodies are in their host shales could have been deposited in less than 20 days. That's amazing. That's another piece of evidence that sort of corroborates the global flood.
Yeah, I'm going to write that down. So 20 days.
I'll send you a link to that article.
Yeah, and I appreciate that because, see, 20 days, this is exactly what I have thought for years. I don't know how long it took to deposit these zinc deposits in my home state of Tennessee, but let's take 20 days. See, we don't need a million years worth of tectonic and geochemical motion to cause this. Okay, Standing for Truth, you want to pick another one from your list and help me to keep track of time. How much time do we have before the 2-hour mark?
He may have gone upstairs.
Okay, no,
for a
no
while.
problem. Let me read. Let me read one of the ones here. Jamie Russell sent in one. Is there geologic evidence of fission or fusion that has occurred naturally? And he asks that God may bless Standing for Truth. The answer to that is yes. There are some deposits worldwide that are very unique uranium deposits where some geologists, completely apart from the creation, evolution, young earth, old earth argument, some geologists that have worked in these mines believe that they have found evidence of an actual fission reaction. I don't know about fusion, but certainly a fission reaction causing what you might think of as a paleo explosion. I would have to do some research to find the exact name. It seems like some people talk about a area maybe in Africa that begins with the letter O, as in Ohio. Do you recall this particular locality, George?
No, I'm sorry. My American geography and geology is very poor. I'm sorry.
Oh, it's no problem at all. Standing for Truth, do you have another question on your board that might be of interest? Also, I'd asked earlier, am I reading the clock right that we've got about 20 minutes left?
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
You are muted, Standing for Truth.
Looks like we've got, we are going on an hour and 40 minutes. We got about 20 minutes left till the 2-hour mark.
Okay, good. Pick a question from your list, my friend.
Sure. A question that came to mind for myself, because we've got a lot of new subscribers and new viewers since your first couple streams and shows and presentations on the Grand Canyon and the formation of the Grand Canyon.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if, even just briefly, because I would direct people to those specific shows where you cover the evidence for your model of the Grand Canyon for hours. But on the spot, if you were with somebody in the elevator and you had a couple minutes to kind of explain why the Grand Canyon itself is testimony of the Great Flood of Noah, how would you best explain that?
Okay, let's use the blocks I borrowed from my grandchildren here. If you imagine the Grand Canyon to be to consist, as it does, of rocks from the creation week down at the bottom, which is illustrated by my hand, and then there are flood year rocks over the top of that, starting down at the bottom with rocks that contain trilobites called Cambrian, the Tapete sandstone, and then going all the way up to where my finger is now, to the Coconino sandstone, which is a white sandstone at the rim of the Grand Canyon that contains the footprints of reptiles and amphibians, it is thought. And then on top of that are some additional erosion layers above it. And then if you look at the Grand Canyon as it is now, and let's go up in an airplane and look, you will see that the Grand Canyon is extremely long. It's a mile deep, and it's in places several miles across. And so there are probably only a few canyons in the world that are equivalent, and that's probably why it's called the Grand Canyon of the Colorado. Well, the argument from flood geology is that the deposition of the rocks occurred during the time of the Great Flood, and then the erosion of the canyon, which is illustrated by this, the erosion of the canyon occurred in the late flood or immediate post-flood time. Dr. Steve Austin has written extensively on his idea of an impounded lake that goes by a number of names. Northeast of the Grand Canyon, imagine a lake, and I'll use my glass of water here as an example. Imagine an impounded lake northeast of the Grand Canyon. Now, keep in mind, this lake is the size of Indiana or Illinois. You know, it's the size of all the area around Toronto, Canada, or all the area near the Great Barrier Reef. This is a huge area of impounded water. It gets impounded behind an earthen barrier, dam, so to speak, and then events late in the flood or post-flood. Dr. Austin and I are of the view that it was after the time of the flood. That water gets released and then flows down, and it's that water that carves the canyon. So the creation of the canyon and the carving of the canyon is best explained by events circling around the Genesis flood.
Well, that's a great response, Professor McQueen, and extremely helpful, especially for myself and people in the audience, for just a quick, really good response. Here's my question, because you mentioned erosion and the fact that a line of evidence for the global flood model is that we see rapid or no erosion between these sediment layers. What, from your experience, Professor McQueen, because it's such good evidence for a global flood and good evidence against uniformitarianism, what do the uniformitarians respond with in regards to the lack of erosion between sediment layers? How do they respond to this?
Now, it is literally the case that if you go to the Grand Canyon, and during the mid-'80s, I hiked the Grand Canyon 5 times in 4 years, went down, spent a week, and then came back up. So I really have seen this with my own eyes. And many have visited the canyon. As you look at the canyon across from the south rim to the north rim, you see this white, 100-meter thick sandstone in a knife-edge contact with the rocks underneath it. Now, when I was going through university, the argument that was given was, well, McQueen, you're naive. What the Coconino Sandstone is a beach front that's moving across what is now the Colorado River Basin in Arizona and other places. And that movement is a moving beach. Okay. When I had been presented with that argument, I said, wait, hold on. Have you never taken your family to a real beach? If you go to a real beach, like is illustrated behind me here in the Gulf of Mexico, about a 5-hour drive south of where we are, if you go to the beaches of southern Mississippi and southern Alabama, along what's called the Mississippi Gulf Coast, when you look at those beaches, you find that daily there is erosion of that surface. There are sand dunes. If this thing's really a moving beach, moving across the western United States, you would expect to find not what are called knife edge contacts, like I put in this photograph, but rather what you would expect to find are wavy contacts. You should find a beach that's got a dune and all kinds of stuff like that. You should find a contact that looks like that in horizontal cross-section. But that's not what you find. So it's another example of how the Bible liberates us in our thinking. if you have a model of creation to explain the copper deposits of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, if you got a worldwide flood to explain the zinc deposits of Tennessee, it also explains how you can have enormous volumes of sandstone being deposited very quickly in a catastrophic environment. And so the evidence of what we see, and I'll go back to my models here, the knife edge contact is an argument for a catastrophic worldwide flood.
That's a really good response. I'm sorry, George.
Also, David, the angle of those layers also suggests that they were deposited by water.
Right. And what George is talking about there, let me move my model a different way. When you go to the Grand Canyon and you hike down, you see what's called cross-bedded sediments. So the sediments are at an angle, and these little amphibians are running at the bottom of the water up this slope. Had a catastrophe here in my own kitchen. They're running up the slope, and quite a bit of work has been done by one of my former students, John Whitmore, and others about the nature of the Coconino sandstone. Your point's well taken.
Can I just sort of go back to the topic again, David? I'm
Yes.
going to try and impress you here on page 14 of your mineral book.
Yes.
You say that there are a good number of minerals beyond just salt in the human body, and I'm talking about particularly because we're discussing copper and zinc. Copper, of course, is necessary for human health, and the best sources are apparently like seafood, organ meats, whole grains,
Yes.
nuts, raisins, legumes, and my favorite, chocolates.
Yes. How true.
And this is right up the alley of standing for truth, because it's a genetics thing. Also, zinc is required by the enzyme. I think more than 200 enzymes in the body require zinc to help process the chemical reactions. So you can get zinc from eating eggs, fish, and various meats and wheat germ. So there's a bit of education.
See, your point is very well taken, because there must have been zinc around in the Garden of Eden for Adam and Eve to be healthy in a vegetarian diet. And so there had to be zinc in the soil of Eden, in the soil of the pre-flood world, because as you point out, these elements like zinc and trace amounts of copper, obviously iron in the hemoglobin in our blood, these elements that are associated with mining and allows us to make a car out of steel are also necessary for our health. And so it's important to me that you see that there were deposits in the pre-flood world, creation week. I did it out of order. Creation week, pre-flood world, the flood produced a lot of these zinc deposits, and then we move on to the post-flood world. Good point.
Yeah, that's a great explanation.
And the Bible does say we're made out of dirt, and well, dirt contains a lot of these elements, doesn't it?
That's exactly right. That without, if 10-year-olds are watching this video, and also maybe some 70-year-olds that have forgotten, when you say dirt, you're talking about soil, and soil consists of sand, silt, and clay, and organic material, depending on what horizon you are. Remember the old A, B, and C horizon of the soil. And so when God talked about the soil, the creation of Adam and so forth, the elements that we find in the human body had to be there in Eden.
That's a great point.
Yes.
That's a great point. I got to say, this has been such a fascinating topic and so many good points and so much good information. Professor McQueen, you are a walking encyclopedia of information. So God bless you for that. A question here from Luca, I think is a good question that a lot of people have when it comes to the biblical ice moment, as you call it. And I like that.
Yes.
How long did it last, do you believe, according to
it's
science?
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. My mentor and former boss, Dr. Henry Morris, believes that there are many references in the book of Job to ice age kind of situations. Job obviously knew about Behemoth and Leviathan, living dinosaurs that were alive in this post-flood time. Keep in mind that most dinosaurs were taken to extinction by the Great Flood itself, but they breathed air, so they were on board the ark, got off the ark, and began wandering over Africa and Europe and all over the earth. And so when you talk about the Ice Age, you're talking about a period that I refer to as post-flood residual catastrophe. That's a several hundred-year period after the time of the flood where the atmospheric conditions, the heat in the ocean, the work of Dr. Vardaman and others have shown that that's a perfect environment for tremendous amounts of snow to fall, especially at the northern and southern latitudes. And so the huge ice packs that we see that were observed by Job, apparently, and observed by the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, lasted not a million years, not 100,000 years, but rather a few centuries, and then melted back to what we see now. And so, as Nephilim says there in Job 38, the face of the deep is frozen. And so it's a good point that in the book of Job, we probably have a man that if he himself hadn't seen it, he had certainly heard stories north of where he lived about some very cold temperatures.
That's a really good answer. One question. For me, this will be probably my last question. I don't want to hog the mic, George. And then maybe you can, actually, I know we're going on the 2-hour mark, but what are your thoughts then on the mammoths, Professor McQueen? I've got a book behind me from Mike Ord where he goes into the mammoths. Would you say that this is a post-flood ice age animal? Were these overall? What are your opinions on? I know there's different opinions on mammoths.
This is something that I first read about 50 years ago. The whole idea of a mammoth mastodon being found in Siberian permafrost, and they cut him up and ate him for hamburgers at night. I've been aware of this for 50 years. And as I've gone through the flood geology scenario, some of these creatures related to elephants were no doubt on board the ark, got off, and so they were living pre-flood and buried pre-flood. But a lot of these Siberian examples that are essentially frozen creatures from which we hope to get DNA evidence and yet another argument for blood and body tissues in creatures like this. They were probably buried in what the fellow Dillow, Dillow, wrote a book in the 70s, I think. Jody Dillow suggested that there were ice tornadoes that swept over these creatures as they migrated from the ark and froze them very quickly. And so there's some pre-flood creatures, mammoths, mastodons, and some post-flood.
Well, that's a great response, Professor McQueen. George, brother, I know we're going on the 2-hour mark, and I know you probably got to head out any second. So did you have a last question you might have wanted to ask, or any final comments in pertaining to the topic?
Yeah. It's not a question, but I was amazed when I read some of this stuff. Research has shown that, and we've all heard about the novel coronavirus pandemic, but it can survive for days on glass, plastic, and stainless steel surfaces. But get a load of this, it dies within hours on a copper surface. Copper has antimicrobial properties that are effective against a wide variety of disease-causing organisms. In effect, in hospitals, the use of copper and copper alloys on frequently touched surfaces can reduce the number of patients who acquire infections during a hospital stay. So there's a lot to say about copper and, its benefits.
Yes. Ms. McQueen and I have been advised by our physicians to take an extra bit of vitamin D each night and zinc. Maybe we should add copper to the regimen. Maybe I can get some by licking this bowl. No, I'm not going to do that.
Hey, David.
Yes.
A priest is driving along a country road when he's pulled over by a copper, right?
By copper. Okay.
Okay. He says, "Have you been drinking?" he asks. "Just water," replied the priest. The cop says, "So why do I smell wine?" The priest looks over at the bottle and says, "Good Lord, he's done it again."
Water into wine. Oh, that's quite a joke, my friend.
Well,
Okay,
George,
guys,
looks like you're going out with a bang.
Yeah, I have to go, David and Standing. Look, it's been really good. I'm going to rewatch this and listen to some of the finer points that were made. But I'm sorry. I've got a 15-minute drive to take my car to the mechanic.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, brother.
Standing for truth. I've got a final question for you. Is it still okay for Mrs. McQueen to join me next Wednesday, and we can talk about teaching Genesis to 10-year-olds?
Absolutely. I think that would be a blessing and an honor. And that would be a stream that my wife would love to tune into as well, because the future homeschooling of our kids is important. So, yeah, no, I would love that.
Mrs. McQueen,
make that the topic.
Yeah. Ms. McQueen and I are writing a book about teaching Genesis to 10-year-olds, and she'll be sharing some of her creationist testimony and the experience that we've had over the last 10 years in teaching a group of 10-year-olds. So we'll look forward to that next week. Amen. May I wish God's blessing, and then you can go ahead and I will move my arrow and close myself out. Okay.
Amen. God bless you. I'm looking forward to next week with you and Mrs. McQueen. It's going to be a lot of fun. And thank you again, Professor McQueen, for a must-watch, highly informative show today. So God bless you, Professor McQueen, and have
very
yourself
kind words, my friend. Goodbye for now.
Goodbye. Okay, guys. Well, we are going to wrap it up here. Once again, we are just over the 2-hour mark. Anybody who's new to this channel and enjoys Professor McQueen's lectures and presentations and question and answer periods as much as I do, please check out the playlist that I've made for Professor McQueen, where we have pretty well touched on every single aspect of the flood and uniformitarianism that you can think of, as well as we have addressed pretty well every single argument that the critics could throw at us and could throw at the global flood, and we've demolished them all. So that's a series I highly recommend. Also, please subscribe to my alternative channels. I put them in the chat. There's 2 channels that I'm going to be frequently re-uploading our past debates, interviews, and discussions. The more channels, the better, because it's important to get the truth out there. and to get this information out there to as many people as possible. So Brother Montaz says, Kent tomorrow, yes. A must-watch debate tomorrow, 8 o'clock EST, 7 Central. Kent Hovind's going to be taking on Jordan. Jordan and Brother Nephilim Free just had a debate probably a few weeks ago. Time flies by, on the same topic, Age of the Earth. That's a must-watch debate. Please check that out. And we are in the midst of setting up a couple debates with Nephilim Free as well. So lots to look forward to, guys. And I hope everybody had fun. As always, next week when Professor McQueen is back with us, bring your questions, any questions that are on your mind. That's what we're here for. So Brother Neff says, thanks for helping people see the truth, SFT. Amen. All the glory to God. We do what we can to bring the truth to people and ultimately the gospel. So God bless everybody, and everybody have a good night, and we'll see you tomorrow. SFT is out.